We've seen norm temperatures, temperatures much above the norm in the North Pole, in Siberia, several regions of the Arctic for recent winters and years. Just 2 weeks ago, I think Berlin was at minus 11 degrees colder than the North Pole at the same time. That is certainly not the usual case. So we also see ocean acidification. We see the glaciers melting. We see permafrost thawing, releasing pollutants in the atmosphere, of course, with massive impacts on ecosystems. So that, this massive amount of impact that we see by climate change. So what do we do about this? I want to focus on trying to find solutions. So this is a graph from 2017, which will see a significant update, I think, soon enough, as new nationally determined contributions come up and are being published. As of now, I think it still holds the general notion quite well that we are not doing nearly enough. So the climate negotiations are an international process. That means that states are negotiating among themselves and are also the main actors. I'll come to that in a second as well, more detail. So states having set themselves goals, it's important to see also if these goals are sufficient. So the Paris Agreement in 2015 brings basically the whole of the world, including now the US again, together around the table and sets the general goal in terms of limiting temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius and aiming towards an increase of only 1.5 degrees. So that's the goal that you can see here in green and dark green and light green. So this shows a significant decrease in emissions that we need to do as quickly as possible to be on that path. We need ambitious national plans. But as you can see now, the national plans, as they were submitted in the first round of NDCs between 2015 and some came in a little later, 2017-18 sometimes, the current national sort of ambition that we are at, the ambition level, would still lead to a temperature increase by 2100 by 3.3 degrees Celsius. So we are far behind, a little bit better than the reference scenario, but there's still lots of emissions gap that we need to cover and fill. So that was going to be my second YouTube video showing the regional warming hitting the Arctic in particular, but I'm sure you can find it on YouTube. Happy to share the links after the meeting. So why are the negotiations so important, and why are they now different than they used to be? So I want to touch upon the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. The first one is from 1992, the second one from 2015. And as you can see in this graph, the economic output and with it related the output of CO2 and tons of greenhouse gas emissions has changed massively over that kind of time. I hope you can see it. It's a little short, a little small, the explanation, but I hope you can see the countries in general. You see the big blue-greenish tones at the bottom, which are the USA and EU. You see the big dark red is China. No puns intended there. And then we have, of course, other OECD countries in yellow, the Russian Federation in green, and other big G20 countries in lighter red. So, but you can see the main emission contributors worldwide in the early 1990s, which you can see about the middle of the slide, looked vastly different. The OECD countries easily contributed to over a half, if not 2/3 of global emissions. This graph has massively changed due to rising output, due to outsourcing of production, due to China becoming the global powerhouse, of course, also due to growing populations worldwide. So the distribution, as well as the overall output of greenhouse gases has changed drastically since the early 90s. And 2015, which you see at the right end of the slide, shows a vastly different situation that was there when the Paris Agreement was agreed on. We have a much bigger distribution across the world, and the original sort of split between then called developed countries and developing countries, I'm aware is not sort of the proper terminology anymore, but it's still used actually in the language and the negotiation texts, that split has changed massively. So we need everyone on board in terms of emissions reductions to make sure that this works and also works for the Arctic. So these are just a couple of sort of main stops that we had along the negotiation process. I'll highlight just a few of them here. Happy to answer more questions on that later. We have the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a scientific body which brings together existing scientific expertise and releases assessment reports every 7 years. So we have those gathering in the late 80s and basically providing the scientific foundation for the climate negotiations, which are not part of the negotiation process per se, but also often linked to it in certain agenda items that we discuss. Then the legal framework starts in 1992 with the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which enters into force 2 years later. So mid-90s, basically, we already have agreement that man-made climate change is contributing to these global changes, and being a source of it, we also need to do something about it. And this results also very quickly in an attempt to distribute the sort of emission goals across the different parties to the agreement and also to different emission levels. And we have a Kyoto Protocol. I'll get to that in a second. And then you can see the Copenhagen with a negative smiley. That was a big attempt to adjust basically the negotiation process to the new realities in the new millennium. Unfortunately, parties weren't able to agree on a new agreement then, and it took the process to recover from that until 2015, the Paris Agreement was decided upon. So we have three main legal framework that we currently have still in force. That's the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. And the Katowice rulebook, which is mentioned here for 2018, that was one of the major parts, how we try to implement the Paris Agreement. Because the agreement itself, with its articles and a couple of pages, basically, it's not that long if you read it in its entirety, it does not provide enough detail. It sets the framework, it sets out what we aim to achieve, but it doesn't go into all the specific details. That's why we need the specific decisions by the Framework Convention, by the Paris Agreement, to implement these decisions. And that's why we have the Katowice rulebook that sort of gives us the handbook, how reporting could look like will look like in the future, how a global stocktake looks like, what a compliance system looks like, etc. So the Katowice rulebook really sort of fills in the gaps and elaborates on the requirements of the Paris Agreement. So that's the process in a nutshell. Why are we still talking about the UNFCCC? Because it's really, first it's a landmark agreement that brings the world together and acknowledging that change in the Earth's climate are a common concern of humankind. That is one thing, but it also sets out the scene and also the institutions that we still use to negotiate. So it sets up a UNFCCC secretariat that's also organizing the meetings of the Kyoto Protocol and of the Paris Agreement. It sets up a governing body called the COP, which we always talk about, the Conference of the Parties. That's a body that actually takes the major decisions under the UNFCCC. But the COP meetings are also the same meetings where party representatives are meeting to decide on things about the Kyoto Protocol, if parties are part of that agreement as well, and to the Paris Agreement. So we have the COP meetings, but they are actually not just COP meetings, but also meetings of the CMP, that's meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol, and the CMA, that's a meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement. So people sometimes represent, in my case, Germany or the EU would represent or would be in the same room and just change hats basically, and have once the hat as a UNFCCC representative, once as a Kyoto Protocol representative, and once as a Paris Agreement representative. So these meetings are open and closed individually, but they all can take place at the same conference physically. So that's why the UNFCCC is important. It sets the framework. It requires states to have inventories, so we are actually aware of the size of the problem, if we don't know how many greenhouse gas emissions we are producing in which sectors, we also don't know where to tackle them best and most cost efficiently. And then it sets out a number of other issues. Kyoto Protocol, then the second agreement as set out before, sets out a commitment period. The first one between 2008 and 2012, and a second one that lasted until late last year, end of 2020. So it was expanded. It took a different approach. It took a sort of top-down approach, setting the targets on the international level, and then the states that committed to it, listed in one annex of the convention, sort of committed also to undertake measures and report on them specifically to ensure that they are within that corridor of decreasing emissions that they agreed to. So that's the Kyoto Protocol's approach. Unfortunately, not all too many countries in the world signed up for that approach to be binding for them. So what we have is something that is enforceable. There's a compliance committee of the Kyoto Protocol that can actually look at the commitments if states are implementing their commitments, and if they're not, it can draw the conclusion and exclude them, for instance, from emission trading internationally or from participation in other of the market mechanisms. So there is basically something that you can do about it because the numbers are specific. But again, if not the whole world signs up, there is a limited reach to what you achieve. So I think that's one of the main takeaways from the Kyoto Protocol, that this top-down approach in terms of setting international goals on the international level very specifically, and then trying to enforce them didn't work all too well in gathering the whole world. And as I've shown you with the slide before, we need the whole world on board. So that's why I think the main impetus to develop something in Copenhagen and then in Paris was really there to get the whole world on board and focus on emission reductions, which seem at the first glimpse more voluntarily, but are also commitments that need to be implemented nationally. But they are not in the same exact way enforceable as in the Kyoto Protocol. So times have changed since the 90s, of course, and that's why Paris takes a different approach than Kyoto. So this is also a little small print, but I'm happy to share the presentation afterwards, so apologies for that. I'll just want to touch upon the structure of the Paris Agreement. This is actually from a publication from colleagues of mine from Ecologic Institute, published in early 2016 when I started at the negotiations. They had been part of the negotiations up to Paris. They actually provide a decent overview, I think, which is still valid in terms of how the agreement is structured and what components are there to find. Again, I want to highlight just a few of the things. The one is the purpose, Article 2. So we have a lot of purpose in the Paris Agreement, but the three namely ones would be mitigation, adaptation, and greening the finance flows. Those are, iterated throughout the agreement, and also the 2-degree goal that you'll find there is one of the mitigation is in that purpose article. So Article 2 is, of course, hugely important. It sets the scene and also draws up the general goal that people worldwide can refer to. But how we do that and how we implement it, this is set out in a number of articles. And again, it puts mitigation and adaptation on the same level. It mentions greening finance flows, so there you have the 3 purposes in Articles 4, 7, and 9. But again, it takes up the issues that also the Framework Convention highlighted before. It means technology transfer. How do we get evolved technologies and developed technologies also to states who don't, have them just yet, to make sure that we have the best technologies at hand and develop greenhouse gas emission reduction technologies more cost effective. How do we do capacity building? How then do we do the reporting? The transparency framework is one of the major achievements, I think, in the Paris Agreement, because it really tries to give the whole agreement some sort of overarching attempt to bring together what states are doing worldwide. And for this, we need unified reporting requirements, take into account the national circumstances and capabilities of parties. Some are have been reporting for years and decades. Others are just getting up to speed. So there are some sort of leeways and flexibilities built in, but in general, it's one transparency framework built by the parties. So transparency is hugely important. And as you see at the very bottom line, building on the commitments, the nationally determined contributions, and then sort of on the reporting under the transparency framework, we hopefully will get to learn if it all pays off and if we actually are doing enough as a world community. So that's what it feeds into. It feeds into the global stocktake. That's coming up in 2023, every 5 years, to see if we're doing enough. On the side, upside down, if you can read it, it's the implementation and compliance mechanism under the Article 15. That was actually one of the things I was part of negotiating for the EU. And in the Paris Agreement, the compliance mechanism looks very different from the Kyoto Protocol. So it's very soft in terms of that it doesn't force anyone to do something, but it really is focusing on facilitation of implementation and helping states to be compliant with their own commitments. But it also can start procedures when they are not submitting their reports in time, if they're not handing in their NDCs in time, etc. So there are use cases for this compliance committee, but it's not as strict as the Kyoto Protocol compliance mechanism. So where's the Arctic in all of this? I will touch upon the negotiations a little bit more in detail, but also due to my own mishap there, we don't have a lot of time. So I'll focus on the main things now. The Arctic is not mentioned in the agreements as in terms of actual solutions. That is shocking, I guess, but the main takeaway I think here is the Arctic is used as the canary in the coal mine. It shows how drastically climate change, man-made climate change, is affecting the world and affecting ecosystems, and how it also includes feedbacks that then bring back rising or lowering temperatures to the rest of the world. So the Arctic really is used as a showcase and as an example and as a dire warning case. So I think it has been very much used in the climate negotiations also to draw to the need for drastic action in accordance with sea level rise as well. So I think that's one of the key takeaways. But of course, there are many negotiation topics with direct relevance to the Arctic. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, the impacts of climate change are huge. So we need to also estimate how much we actually need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to make sure that areas like the Arctic are not warming at such a threatening speed as they're doing right now. So of course the mitigation target is important, and also the adaptation measures, because there are communities living in the Arctic. There's permafrost thawing away, settlements losing a valuable coastline, infrastructure is crumbling, and we have rising sea levels. So there's a lot of adaptation components that need to be considered there as well. And the science, of course, as well. I've sent you the link there. If you want to have a look at the IPCC, it actually has a special report on the oceans and the cryosphere, and draws a sort of showcases which are actually the biggest sort of tipping points and threats that the Arctic is facing under a 2-degree world with increasing temperatures, and how much worse it is actually with 2 degrees compared to 1.5 degrees. Because again, in the Arctic, this is not 1.5 or 2, this is much more likely to be 5, 6, or 7 degrees Celsius. So have a look at that report. The science base confirms how important the climate change action is to prevent the cryosphere from literally melting away. The second part is the participants with Arctic background in the negotiations. I've mentioned it's a state and party-driven process, but that means there are also observers and lots of civil society and environmental organization involved. So the Arctic states are, of course, part of the process. The US just rejoined the Paris Agreement, but of course we have Russia, we have the European states, we have Norway in there as well, and Canada. So all of these are part of the negotiation process, but not all of them identify themselves as Arctic nations. So as you can tell, The Paris Agreement, because it deals with negotiations on greenhouse gases, and greenhouse gases are linked to almost all economic development, it really is an economic agreement rather than a purely environmental agreement. So every greenhouse gas emission that's to be saved is always discussed under the threat of losing out on development, losing out on technology, losing out on wealth and GDP. So it's a very sort of economic-driven negotiation at times. So it's not just an environmental agreement. So also the Arctic states, of course, are in a position where they also have the rest of their economy in mind when negotiating this. So they are not there as Arctic states in that function, but negotiating on behalf of the whole economy, of the whole sort of population that they represent. So sometimes the Arctic takes a little bit of a backseat, but that's not to say that's always the case, because we do have, for instance, the indigenous representatives, which I need to highlight. We have indigenous peoples organizations which are present in the climate negotiations and are very vocal, very present, very visible, and do an excellent job in also linking their voices and making themselves heard in the negotiation process when they can. And I'll get to that, what that means. So, but if somebody asks you, what does the Paris Agreement actually do about all of this in climate change? This is the slide. It does look too pretty, I agree, but this is one I want you to remember. It's about a cycle between commitments and reporting on the progress of these commitments. So we have the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions from 2015. They have been updated on the international level. We discussed this. And now the second phase of NDCs, the second phase of commitments, is being submitted late last year. Some states have been front runners, others are a little late. The EU was just in time by the end of 2020 in December to submit its new NDC. So the key part to remember is with Paris, every NDC that's submitted needs to be better and more ambitious than the previous one. So while you set the start point yourself, every second or third or fourth NDC then needs to ratchet up. So this mechanism then is brought to the international level, which is here the bottom line, and then we'll have these stock takes to see if we're doing enough. And that should then inform the next round of NDCs and lead to more ambitions. So it's a smart mechanism in that it attracts all states to participate at the speed and the level that they can afford, but also requires them to become better over time. That's a really simplified version. But yeah, I think that's important to understand, because it really shows what the Paris Agreement can and what it can't do, also for the Arctic. For the Arctic, we're talking about ice-free summers as early as 2030. The latest maybe at 2040, 2050. So if we have 5-year cycles for the NDC, we might notice that we are too late, and then 5 years later, we'll still notice that we are too late in doing something. So what the Paris Agreement does is it sets goals, the ultimate goal of 2 degrees with an ambition towards 1.5, and it provides the tools of reporting and making sure that worldwide we know what we're doing. But it's not the only agreement to fight climate change. That's important to keep in mind. Sometimes people put a lot of pressure on these negotiations to have these outcomes, because they are these focal points where important people meet, where financial commitments are being explained and declared. And that's all right and good, but that's not all of it. There needs to be climate action from the state level, from the national level, from the region level, outside the Arctic and inside the Arctic as well, to protect the Arctic environment and the rest of the world as well. So I think that's really important to have in mind. This is a slow process. And when the demand is being put on the climate negotiations to provide, we need more ambitious targets now, that's not built into that process that we're seeing on the slide. That is a part of it. And certainly the ambition needs to go up. But the ambition goes up in 5-year cycles. And as parties have agreed to this, they will stick to the 5-year cycle as of this point, unless there's a new agreement, of course, to do this even quicker. So sometimes the expectation towards the COP to deliver something much more tangible is not, I understand where the demand is coming from, but also just from the process that's being set up, you can already expect that it's unlikely to happen, because states commit every 5 years. At this point. This is a quick overview what's next. So the second round of NDCs is trickling in. It should be there in 2020, but some are a little later. So this year we're still seeing NDCs being updated. Some states, of course, had to fight hard fight with the COVID pandemic, even more than others. I guess all have been, heavily occupied with other aspects, and so maybe the NDC development took a little bit of a backseat here or there. And we still need to develop and finish the rulebook, for instance, on international markets. That's still outstanding. So the Katowice rulebook closed on many issues, but not all of the issues that are being described in the Paris Agreement. So Article 6 is one of those that talks about market mechanism. We also need to talk about how the finance goal looks like after 2025. So currently there's a commitment by parties to contribute 100 billion a year to prevent the worst catastrophes and support states in their efforts. But that goal is up to 2025. So we need to negotiate soon how the goal will look like after 2025. That's going to start this year. And then again, the global stocktake as sort of like a first look at how are we doing internationally with this new round of NDCs is going to come up in 2023. So how to find consensus? I want to focus a little bit on the negotiation process because these rooms are, hard to get into. You need to be an accredited observer or be a member of a party delegation to be actually in these rooms. You can, live stream a lot of these events. So if there's something coming up in June, again, I, warmly recommend that you take the time and find an interesting slot that you would be interested in and see how these things look like in practice. This is one of the rooms, and you have to imagine you have to bring together 197 states. That's a lot of room that you need. They have vastly different priorities. Again, it's always depending on the economic policies. They're all equal, at least on the vote count. So any state like Luxembourg or Liechtenstein would have the same voting power as the US. But of course, they don't have the same negotiation background and not the same influence just economically. So, but formally you have an equality of states and every state technically could stand up and veto. So it's important to bring everybody on board. At the same time, we already have these massive consequences of climate change, not least in the Arctic, but also rising sea levels. Small island states are facing severe consequences already, just to name a few. And there's limited time to negotiate. We cannot negotiate for the whole year. So we focus on 2 weeks in spring, usually, or early summer, that's May, sometimes June. And the second 2 weeks are usually the COPs in, that's November, December, usually. So we have the summer preparation, and then in COP, at the COP, we usually have the decision making. It is really hard to structure these negotiations because there's so many topics and you need to come from a diversity of priorities and opinions down to a compromise solution. So the COP mechanism, the negotiation mechanism uses that and goes down different levels of hierarchy. So I'll just touch briefly on this. The COP plenary is the beginning and the end point. That's the green squares that you can see. So that's the main governing body. They need to decide upon what they want to do. And these are all states being represented in the COP plenary. But between that, all these different focus topics that we have on the agenda are distributed in smaller bodies. So that also means you need more experts and you need more people who can work in parallel. So you'll put all the mitigation experts in one room and then the adaptation experts in the next one and the compliance people in the next one and the transparency in another one. And then there will be informal consultations, of course, and where the outreach is drawn even further. And below that is the informal group where not even the secretariat usually takes place to take notes. So it's just the states among themselves to find progress in discussion groups, basically, to maximize the time. They will just find sometimes a corner in a corridor, and then you'll see 20 people squatting around 2 laptops trying to find and make headway. So that's and then at the end of this, because of course all this needs to feed into the transparent process, at the end of this you need to make sure that this is all approved then by the plenary at the end. So, everything that goes down in the chain needs to go up again. And then we'll have the plenaries of the subsidiary bodies. This is the SBI, for instance. We have 2 subsidiary bodies under the COP focusing on different topics. And then once the SBI approves, in this case of the example, then it goes to the COP and the COP can approve. So ideally, these plenaries look quite boring, as like a parliamentarian session would look like if everybody knows already what's going to be on the agenda. So the COP president would just go through the agenda and say, well, we have item 2.A. We have the document XYZ, which has been put forward. Do I see any objections? Nobody says something. I see no objections. It is so decided. And then he or she will gavel that document and it's approved. So in an ideal case scenario, it goes through in the plenary. So all these discussions and fights are on the technical level on these bottom parts that I'm showing here. This is the ideal scenario. So in 2 weeks, you'll have a first week until Saturday to negotiate. And on the second week, there's also the high-level segment when all the important people show up and show their commitment to the process. So basically, we have to finish negotiations within 8 days. And that's a lot of time. And from 7 a.m. in the morning, sometimes for pre-discussions up to late at night, sometimes in hard cases, there were negotiations up to 3, 4 a.m. It can take in several topics a lot of time to come to an agreement. And sometimes you'll face blockages which you cannot solve within a day, and then you have to rest for the next one and continue. So it looks more like this, just to show you on one real life example, actually on a negotiation topic that I was negotiating up to 2018. And I just tried to put my calendar entry sort of like into a schematic slide like this. So it shows like, and one square there stands for 1 hour, and that was one negotiation topic. So you see just how many informals you need after each meeting and between meetings, just to make sure you make progress on the text. So sometimes a 1 hour session in the official setting adds another 6 or 7 hours of negotiation in the informal setting afterwards, just to get things done. And the next day again. So you can tell it's not, and that was just one topic. I had, I think, 3 topics in that COP to follow, and sometimes negotiators have as many as 6 or 7. So you can't be possibly in all the rooms at all the times. So I want to close here, unfortunately, because I stole a bit of time from the presentation with the focus on the non-party stakeholders, because where the Arctic, where the indigenous peoples come in, this is mostly the non-party stakeholders. This means NGOs. This means indigenous peoples organizations. And those have specific procedural rules to follow, just as states have, but it's a party and state-driven process. So observers have less rights to be present in certain rooms, but they do have the right to have a plenary statement. So these groups usually have a plenary statement. This is where the attention lies, where the media representatives are there. It's in the live stream. So this is where they can get the focus of attention. So plenary statements is a huge deal to be heard. But again, the statements are limited to 3 minutes. So it's, it's not everything. They need to have more. So they are in some rooms present, but not in all of these rooms I showed you before. But in some cases, like in the Indigenous Peoples platform, the parties invited representatives to be and sit on the table because it was about them, of course. So Indigenous peoples, including from the Arctic, were invited to the process to sit at the table and also, voice their preference, which was key for that negotiation agenda item. But in some other items, observers are just not in the room because it's informal, it's states only. And unless states invite them, no observer will be there. That has disadvantages and advantages. It can, convince some states to, break from their public position and sort of come around, and they need closed doors for that. But also, of course, it's limiting the transparency of the process. But of course, media coverage is important. We have lots of demonstrations in front of the COP venues. So there are many ways to make yourself heard and seen. And actually, media representatives cover much more press conferences than some negotiation setups. So, you can voice yourself and be heard. And the COP is not just the negotiation, but also many side events, many press conferences, many ways to get the attention of the world stage. So that's why I think it's important for non-party stakeholders to engage in those as well. We do have some negotiation items. I'm not going to touch upon them too much now, but I want to mention the Local Communities Indigenous People Platform is something that has been set up new under the UNFCCC, not under the Paris Agreement. And it includes a constituted body, which is a working group, which has 50% at this point of indigenous representatives. So that's something completely new, and also has a representative from the Arctic region being present in these meetings. So the Arctic has now a voice in the sort of implementation of the Paris Agreement, in this case of the UNFCCC, but in these climate change negotiations as well. And the platform organizes a web portal to exchange best practices. It organizes workshops and seminars on indigenous knowledge and participation. It asks parties for submissions to explain, for instance, right now, how curricula are informed by traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge. So there are ways to influence the process with these little footholds and extra bodies and agenda items to make the Arctic heard and give them a voice. Just to show you how it looks like in practice, because I've talked about informal informals, this is actually, I think, a more formal setting. You can see me next to the red-haired lady. So that's the European Union flag, and that's maybe 50 lawyers in one room. And that's the same hierarchical segment for transparency. So just to show you between 50 people and maybe 300 in one room, it's the same hierarchical level. So depending on the topic, it will gather more attention by more people and more groups, and also more media and NGO representatives. So of course, transparency is better than compliance. So here you see just the lawyers, and here you see everybody. But it's the same hierarchical level of negotiation. It can look very, very different. This is from the Indigenous Peoples Platform. Actually, I took the picture behind the chair. I was facilitating that exchange in 2017 in an informal setting. There was no secretariat, there was no presidency. So they asked somebody from the negotiators if we could moderate. Because you see the classroom setting, you can't see the others. You need to turn around to see the others. So somebody needs to sit front and moderate the discussion, and that's what I did. So I'll close there. There are results, the negotiation results. These are a lot of happy indigenous colleagues and negotiators. When we finalize the setup of the Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities platform, you also see some Arctic Indigenous peoples there as well. So there are results, but they are, again, procedural and technical. So I'll not touch upon these complicated slides. So I'll close with that. Civil society engagement is important. Also to save the Arctic, because the climate negotiations provide a framework for vision and increased ambition and reporting. And that's really important. And they also provide the venue to come together and exchange. But just by itself, this is not going to do it. We need more than that. And we need more on the national and the regional level. So there are many, many other fora and institutions which contribute to that. The Regional Forum, the Arctic Council, which you'll have heard already quite a bit about, and we'll hear more in a bit. You'll have the Convention on Biodiversity, which is also touching upon many issues of Arctic relevance. You'll have the International Maritime Organization, which talks about shipping, and the Polar Code. So there are many international governance fora which also touch upon the Arctic, and which all need to, pull their weight and do their fair share to make sure that the Arctic is protected. Thanks for the time.
Thank you. And if everyone could give a huge virtual round of applause for not only a comprehensive and intimate view of climate negotiations, but also the navigation of technical difficulties. We appreciate it. We will take a few questions now before going to our second speaker. Devora, do you want to come on and ask your question first?
Yeah, sure. So I wasn't sure thank you so much. I took a ton of notes. I want to be in touch with you later this week to talk about a group project from the fellows looking to perhaps develop a framework or a set of climate and environmental justice principles. So I think you would be fabulous to talk to about that, particularly within the frame of the civil society engagement. So that was a great little pointer. My question is, is it accurate? I'm not sure if I heard you right, that the Arctic communities and Arctic states do not have additional weight, or they don't have additional leverage, even though the impacts are on them specifically in these negotiations. Is that accurate? And if yes, how did that come to be? Like, how is that? Yeah.
In short, yes, that's the case. It comes to be because it's a multilateral environmental agreement. So it's just by public international law principles, every state has a vote, and it's states who set up the process. So it basically is something that is one of the few agreements that has basically universal coverage, including like 197 parties to the agreement, including the European Union also as a state sort of group of states. But yeah, every state has one vote, so hence no examples. There's no exceptions from that rule, and even the states hit the hardest. They have some special recognition. So for instance, small island developing states, the SIDS, do have special recognition, and they are sometimes to make sure that they're not underrepresented, they get special positions in certain bodies, for instance. So they just to make sure that they have a voice to be heard. So in terms of the constituted bodies, sometimes they get leveraged a little bit higher up, but in terms of like the general decision-making process, every state one vote, and observers not at all.
Okay, thank you so much. That's very helpful.
Madison, do you want to come on and ask your question?
Yeah, it's not particularly Arctic related, and I'm also a little bit biased as I work in nitrogen science. But all the COP negotiations and a lot of the discussion on climate change, the dialogue is always focused on carbon emissions such as CO2 and methane. Do you think some other greenhouse gases such as N2O are being addressed enough in these discussions, or are they kind of forgotten about?
I mean, the greenhouse gas debate, I mean, yeah, in the public perception, I think CO2 and methane play the biggest role, but actually covered by the UNFCCC is a basket of 6 greenhouse gases. So that's sort of not just the one, but it's usually handed down to the technical experts to discuss, where are the sources, how, are there any sinks, if at all, and how we can sort of, tackle them. So that's usually, I think it's a focus on attention, and you'll see, I mean, that, but others might not, the CO2 EQ, that's sort of CO2 equivalence, but that covers all other greenhouse gases emissions as well, which are sometimes converted to CO2 to make it easier to compare. But they are part of the deal, but not all of them. For instance, black carbon isn't, and that's a big deal. Because that's affecting the Arctic also in a major way, and also by actually Arctic emissions, with a much more regional focus than other greenhouse gas forces. So there are gaps certainly, but trying to get new gases into the system at this point is probably political capital that would be required that could be used elsewhere, because there are excellent initiatives to tackle black carbon and methane under the Arctic Council, under the Clean Climate and Air Initiative, etc. So there are a number of other fora where this makes probably more sense than to bring 197 states to agree to make it part of that agreement.
Thank you.
And we can link to some of those additional mechanisms for everyone to explore. Brittany, do you want to come on and ask your question next?
Sure. Hi there. Thank you very much for your presentation. I had to step away, so I apologize if you touched on this, but I was just curious if you found within the COP spaces and in your work and public international law, if you've been around conversations related to the rights of nature and Earth jurisprudence in terms of protecting the Arctic, and if you could speak a little bit about that, or if you had any resources you'd recommend. That's something I'm considering exploring for our briefing papers. So I thought you might have some insight to that.
Right. It's an interesting topic and an interesting concept. I haven't come across it. I mean, of course, in conversations with colleagues who are, focusing on the human rights perspective, for instance, and focusing on the indigenous perspective, but not within the negotiation itself, not so much. couldn't say that. Maybe in certain terms of side events, etc. But it doesn't play a massive role. Again, we are already fighting to. I mean, fighting. It's the indigenous groups, for instance, who fight a lot. To bring the perspective from the regional level to the international level. So that's already hard enough in a party-driven process to get the voices heard. So rights of nature are probably one extra link away from that. Sorry to be so direct, but yeah.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions before switching over to our second speaker. Pat, do you want to come on and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. These negotiations have been a bit of a mystery to me, so very interesting to see that. I have several questions regarding the outside parties and their presence during negotiations or during the meetings. I'll just ask you one of them. I know that at the Paris Agreement negotiations, there were meetings of philanthropic foundations, namely American and European. And I was just wondering how and did their presence influence any element of the process or in the negotiations?
Hard to say. I wasn't part of the meeting, so I don't know what they discussed. But having said that, it's for me, I mean, that's my personal view, which I'm happy to share. My personal view is there are at least 3 worlds at the negotiations. So one world is the technical expert level. That's the level I'm working at. So we're discussing the agenda items. We're trying to find solutions and work on text. So that's the very expert-based world. The second one is a political world. That's much more in terms of when prime ministers or presidents or ministers come in and also announce how much money they're going to spend on adaptation fund or the Green Climate Fund. That's a political level with pledges, which is not strictly always part of the negotiations, but is also very important to implement the agreements, right? So you need the money, you need the commitment, you need these initiatives. So you have that sort of political announcement level definitely as an important part of the negotiation, but I'm not in touch with those. I'm not deciding on the German budget on how much we spend. This is ministerial stuff. I'm being there as a technical expert. So that's the second world, the political one. The third one would be the side event and NGO and civil society world, I would say, because there are so many networks being drawn up, projects being promoted, new ideas being sparked. And so if you have 20,000 participants at a COP, and only 8,000 or 9,000 will be negotiated. The rest will be media, projects, industry, trade unions, you name it. So all of these will be there. So just coming back to your question, there are plenty of meetings which I never have even seen. There are sometimes 1 or 2 side events I manage during 2 70-hour weeks. So that's as much as I can, because there are just so many other communication things going on that I need to be on top of. So I just don't have time to participate in these side events. So I'm not even aware of what's going on there. So in terms of negotiation influence, I think what you mean is the technical negotiations, not so much. Does it, have an effect? And, do these people want to get the word of what they're doing and where they could influence more and create networks? Definitely, that's for sure.
Thank you. And our final question, Louisa, do you want to come on and ask yours?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Agne, for your presentation. I have one question, actually, and it's dedicated to the carbon pricing, because as we know, the carbon pricing is most efficient way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But I just want to know your personal opinion. Do you think Arctic states have a bigger responsibility for creating such a strong and strict price pollution inside the countries? Because on the one hand, we have Sweden, the Arctic state, where is the highest carbon tax in the world, more than 123, I think, US dollars per ton. And at the same time, we have US and Russia. They don't have carbon taxes, just in some states. So yeah, just your personal opinion. It's really interesting. Thank you.
That's a tricky one. We're live streaming on YouTube, and I'm a member of the Kyoto Protocol Compliance Committee, so there's limited what I can say to that. Maybe I'll just deflect in a positive way. So there is, there's many things to differentiate. So we have the international level, of course, we have CDM, we have joint implementation, and we have emission trading on the international level, but we also have national measures like the ones you listed, sort of carbon taxes on the national level, emission trading systems like RGGI and the Californian system in the US. So that's already like vastly sort of different opinions I have on both of these levels. And the second one would be in terms of responsibility to do something. I think sort of if you talk about the markets, they don't factor in the responsibilities on the international level. It is about sort of most cost-efficient allocation of reduction. So that's the general impetus. So it doesn't sort of look like who emitted more, but where can we save emissions most productively and also exchange technology and capacity, build capacity in the process. So I think the approach is somewhat different. It doesn't focus on so much on sort of justice, if you will, sort of like environmental justice is not the core concept when you want to just save emissions. I mean, it should be part of sort of the thinking. There shouldn't be human rights infringements when you have projects to lower emissions, which then lead to credits, which are then traded. So I'm completely on board with that. That should be not a thing. But in terms of sort of setting priorities, it's not. But happy to follow up maybe via email or afterwards, because I've stolen so much of Tom's time already and I feel already very bad. So maybe if that makes sense, there's no easy answer to that. Maybe that's the simple way to put it. Of course, I would prefer if more states were more active, but also I would prefer if they were active not just on the national, but also on the international level. If they committed to that and were trading and had common standards, because 1 ton needs to equal 1 ton. Otherwise, this whole accounting system doesn't work. And that's something that we are still facing in the Paris Agreement negotiations on Article 6, where many states still want to maintain sort of their old credits that they have from the previous system and want to take it over to the new one. So that's already creating some kind of imbalance. But then again, this is a sort of like an EU position, and certainly other states have something to say about this as well. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, a great conversation to have over email or on our Slack channel.
Sure.
But we are into our second hour now. So if everyone can again join me for a virtual round of applause for Arne for answering all of our questions. Thank you. And we are now switching to biodiversity and policies in the Arctic by asking Tom Barry onto our virtual stage, who is the Executive Director of the Arctic Council Working Group, CAF, the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna. I'm not going to take up more of your time, so I'm going to just hand over the virtual mic to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm afraid my bandwidth is quite low, so I'm having trouble with my video. So it's good that my presentation will be short. But it seems like a nice crossover from Arne's discussion, where we're looking at the global scene and where the Arctic might or might not be having an impact in any discussions in that area. But I'll share my screen with you, and what I'm going to do, sorry, I'm at home, my kids are handing me things here. I'm going to sort of quickly run over the Arctic Council and how it addresses the conservation of biodiversity, and give an idea of some of the connections, because I listened to the last part of Arne's talk. So some of the connections whereby the Arctic Council as a regional mechanism might fit into some of the United Nations multilateral environmental agreements. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to stop me as I speak. Otherwise, I would just ramble on. It's a long day of such meetings. And wait, now I'll see if I share my screen. So I hope you can see my my slides. So as Victoria mentioned, I work within the Arctic Council structure, and as I'm sure you're very familiar with the Arctic Council, but having listened to Arne's last few minutes where he was discussing the role of Indigenous peoples and organizations, then I think it's good to start the talk before I go into discussing conservation with just a quick recap on how the Arctic Council is actually structured. So as I'm sure you're aware, it's not a regional agreement. It's not a decision-making body, but it's a consensus-making body. So any actions or any outcomes from the council have to be done by consensus. So there are 8 states and 6 indigenous organizations. And all of these then are served by 6 working groups, which undertake the substantive work of the council in terms of generating data and knowledge to inform decision making. And as you were discussing the concept of observers in the climate change arena, where indigenous peoples or indigenous organizations are classified as observers, in the Arctic Council they have a different category. So you have member states who are the 8 Arctic states, and they decide what happens. They're the decision-making body, but they're obliged to consult with the indigenous organizations on all decisions or actions that they might take. And these indigenous organizations are then given the status of what are known as permanent participants. So while they don't make the decisions in the council, they do have quite an influential voice in what the council does and what it undertakes. And then beyond those indigenous groups, you have a whole range of observer states and organizations from a rapidly increasing array of countries and organizations that are expressing an interest in what's happening in the Arctic. So the Arctic Council was formed in '96. Its primary goals are sustainable development and environmental protection. And when you think about conservation of biodiversity, which is the world which I work in, that's one of the key components or key aspects of ensuring sustainable development and of contributing to or ensuring environmental protection. Oops, sorry, my computer's a bit slow. As Arne was discussing the climate change work, it's always, I'm a geographer by trade, so I always think it's very nice to show a map. And here you can see very clearly those states that are full members of the Arctic Council, and they constitute a very powerful body, both within the Arctic region, but also when you think of those global negotiations, although they haven't actually exercised that collectively in a very direct way. There have been some collective statements by the Arctic states through the Arctic Council into the climate change negotiations, but they've been very general and not very focused. And when I mention observer states, you can see there's 2 groupings of them. Increasingly, are the older observer states who have been there for many years are, of course, the European states such as the United Kingdom, Spain, France, and even Ireland, I think, has applied to be now, I'm Irish, applied to be an observer to the Arctic Council. So there's an increasing interest from European-based states to join in the Arctic Council as it slowly evolves into more of a focus of foreign policy issues and interest for states. And then you can see, of course, the non-Arctic states as well, down around Asia, where you have India, China, Japan, the Republic of Korea, who are relatively new to the Arctic Council and are increasingly active in the work the Council does. And it's important to consider the role that they play in the Council. They don't have a seat at the table like the indigenous organizations do. They're there to observe, and they're directed to contribute their knowledge or their science to the work of the Council rather than to any policy making aspects that the Council might address. Excuse me. So the work of the Council is conducted by 6 working groups. You can think of them as departments within the Arctic Council structure, and a concept known as task forces, which are occasionally established to address specific interests. One of which may be of interest to this group, just listening to the previous conversations, was the most recent task force that was operated in the Council looked at ways to increase Arctic marine cooperation in the Council. And you can link that to the UN negotiations that are starting to try and negotiate a treaty on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, which is helping put an impetus behind Arctic states' discussions together as they try to figure out how they want to react and organize themselves to the potential treaty that might come down the line. So there are 6 groups, each has a different thematic focus. You have the Arctic Monitoring Assessment Program, AMAP, which deals with contaminant issues, mercury acidification, and is generally the mechanism to which the Arctic Council links into climate change discussions, holds side events at the COPs and so on. You have the protection of the Arctic marine environment, which looks at shipping, policy, things like that related to marine issues in the Arctic. Sustainable Development Working Group, which looks more at sort of the whole package of economic and social issues, EPPR, which looks at emergency and prevention and response issues, and ACAP, which looks at contaminants in action program, looks at clean up of issues and contaminants on the Arctic, and has largely been focused on activities within Russia. And then you have CAF, which is the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna, or the Biodiversity Working Group of the Arctic Council, where I'm actually based. So CAF is one of those two groups in the Arctic Council, the other being AMAP, which sit on that divide between science and policy. So our role or our task essentially is try to figure out ways to ensure that information generated from science activities in the Arctic can be used to better inform or support decision making and policy making in the Arctic. And quite a big challenge that the Council faces is how do we, in addition to conducting scientific and monitoring assessment in the Arctic, how do we find ways to incorporate Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous perspectives into the work of the Council? And how do you co-produce or co-design activities so that you try and find or present a more holistic understanding of what's happening in the Arctic? And that's quite a challenging thing to undertake, and there are lots of different activities within the Council focused on that, and we'll maybe, time willing, have a quick look at some of those as I go through my presentation. So this is the mandate of CAF, is to address the conservation of Arctic biodiversity and find ways to promote practices to ensure sustainability of the Arctic's living resources. So this means that CAF works as a tool to facilitate negotiation, to facilitate discussion and cooperation across the Arctic states, and increasingly non-Arctic states are becoming party to that work as well, particularly when you start to look at issues like migratory species, where you have to have a more parity of engagement between non-Arctic and Arctic states as you start to look at migratory species that move from the Arctic down to the southern hemisphere for parts of their lives. When people think about what the Arctic is, it's always a challenge because there's no set boundary. The Arctic Council itself doesn't define the Arctic in a clear way, but each of its working groups have specific definitions. And this map here that you see, that red boundary shows the general operational area within which CAF operates. And it's been the area that we've worked within for the last 25 years or so. And it's a huge area, it covers something like, I think, 32 million square kilometers, something like 5% of the planet's surface. But lately it's becoming more and more fluid as more and more non-Arctic states start to link into what's happening in the Arctic. And there's more and more initiatives that start to look at issues related to biodiversity and other aspects of life in the Arctic with drivers for change or with species that migrate to non-Arctic areas. So it's within that huge area that essentially one of the key challenges facing the Arctic Council or the Arctic states is that how do you shorten that gap between understanding what's happening in the Arctic, detecting the changes that are happening there, and being able to present options or advice or recommendations for policy or decision making in the Arctic. So how do you shorten the time between detection and response? And that's quite a challenge to do because the Arctic is a remote area. It's difficult to collect information there. Everything can often work an awful lot slower. So it's quite a challenge to find ways to be more effective or quicker to respond to the changes that are happening in the Arctic, particularly when you think of the cumulative nature of those changes and the speed at which they're starting to happen. Sorry, a small horse. And so within the CAF working group, what we essentially do is we monitor what's happening in the Arctic ecosystems. We've identified a whole suite of what we call focal ecosystem components across the Arctic. And where if those ecosystem components change, that indicates maybe a greater overall change that we need to pay attention to. So we monitor what's happening to these components, we assess those changes, and from those analysis, we try to determine or derive recommendations for policymakers or advice for monitoring or management. And excuse me, perhaps the key documents within the Arctic Council when it comes to looking at biodiversity issues are, in 2013, the Council released the first circumpolar assessment of status and trends in biodiversity. And that was the first time that they managed to pull together all known knowledge, synthesize it, identify the gaps in our knowledge, tried to detect trends that were happening, the forces that were driving change. And based upon that assessment, they derived a whole suite of policy recommendations, which have since guided the work of the Council. And perhaps key to effectiveness in terms of the Council is that very often you get assessments and you get policy recommendations, but unless you have a clear and distinct action plan to implement those policy recommendations, then they're less effective. And as you perhaps know, the Arctic Council itself has yet to develop or agree upon an overall strategy to guide its work, but it has a strategy, one of only two long-term strategies within the Council that do outline a clear guidance framework for how the Arctic states should address biodiversity concerns in the Arctic. And that document is called Actions for Biodiversity, and it's derived from these policy recommendations. I know that document was due to expire in this year, but due to, of course, COVID and delays in developing a new global biodiversity framework within the United Nations system, it's been extended until 2030, or 2023, sorry. And work now begins to try to develop a new action plan framework for biodiversity for the
Tom,
Arctic. Yeah.
Okay, you started to get very quiet.
Okay, sorry, I was talking way too much, so apologies. Can you hear me now?
I think if you can move slightly closer to your computer, it might be.
Is that better?
That's better. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry. It's one of the challenges when you're living in the north of Iceland, that the internet connection can sometimes be bad. But so I don't know what you didn't hear me say, but essentially this document here, Actions for Biodiversity, is the key document which guides how the Arctic Council addresses biodiversity issues. And it links very closely to what's happening in the global framework when within the United Nations, where they're starting to hopefully complete or conclude agreement on a new global biodiversity framework. And the Arctic Council at the same time now has just started to develop a replacement document to this action plan, which will be designed to link into that global biodiversity framework and try and find ways to ensure that what the Arctic Council does and what happens in the Arctic has a clear defined path to feed into those discussions and those issues where decisions are taken that might reflect an Arctic biodiversity at the global stage. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh,
so,
some people are having a little difficulty.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not sure what I can do about that. I can stop sharing my screen. Maybe that'll help me a little bit with my bandwidth.
I think that where you are now seems to be a bit louder, so I think that might be
okay. Okay. Well, the slide that you have on the screen now gives you an example of the type of information that CAF or the Arctic Council delivers when it comes to biodiversity. Because one of the challenges facing biodiversity or science in general has been very often fantastic science is done, huge assessments are delivered, but they're very difficult to understand. That biodiversity assessment I referred to earlier in 2013, that was like 500 or 600 pages, several hundred scientists involved. It was a great piece of work, but it's very difficult to give that to a decision maker and say, here's what you should do. So we have quite a focus in trying to find ways to more interactively engage or convey complex messages in simpler ways. And the document you have on the screen is a reflection of our marine biodiversity monitoring program, where we've divided into the Arctic into 8 distinct Arctic marine areas. We've identified key components in each of those Arctic marine areas where we need to monitor change. So if change happens, we can understand what's happening and try and act accordingly. So each segment of this pie or the circle represents a distinct marine area, and each concentric circle represents a key focal ecosystem component, from beluga to ring seal up to polar bears. And you can very quickly see that there's an awful lot of information that we don't know what's happening in the Arctic. And this shows you the status of marine mammals. So you can see that for many areas, we just don't know what's happening. And that's not necessarily that there's not information there. It might be that we're not necessarily able to access that information. So for example, in the Kara Laptev Sea, it's either unknown or they're absent. when it comes to understanding what's happening to status and trends of marine mammals in those areas. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not knowledge out there. It just means that perhaps we're not very effective at linking into, for example, the Russian scientific tradition and being able to access information from there. But nonetheless, these type of tools are very helpful in terms of regional planning for the Arctic and the Arctic Council, because you can say, okay, we don't know anything about the Kara-Laptov Sea. Why is that? So that'll help us decide where we focus attention when it comes to data gathering, or where monitoring programs might need to be addressed. And at the same time, we can see, for example, if you see this circle here, which looks at bowhead whales, you can see 5 of the populations there are increasing. And you have to ask why. And when I first saw this graph, I went back to the science document underlying it. And it's not that they're wildly healthy populations, but rather that they're increasing from traditional or from historical harvest in those regions. So you can start to see that these type of tools can help illustrate nice themes and stories that might resonate with policymakers or decision makers, and can help to convey very complex issues to them very quickly, and help them maybe to decide and guide where they actually should apply money, resources, capacity, and monitoring. So it's just one example of one of many different tools that we try to find ways to reach those people who need to hear the information that is being developed by the scientists and the monitoring activities in the Arctic. As I mentioned, there's an increasing number of non-Arctic states which are party to the Arctic Council in the form of observer states. That reflects in itself an increasing challenge for the Arctic Council, because you have the 8 Arctic states, they're the sort of decision makers, and then you have this broad range of often very powerful states, such as China, India, and others, who want to engage in what's happening in the Arctic, and they want to engage in the Arctic Council. And the challenge for the Arctic states within that context is how do they balance expectations or pressure from those states from outside the Arctic who want to engage, and the need for Arctic states to look after their own vested interests. So that balancing act is one of the challenges that the Council faces in coming years, how they actually can manage that in an effective way. And one example of a test case for how non-Arctic and Arctic states can work together is focused around biodiversity, and that's migratory birds. So the Council has identified through the Arctic Migratory Birds Initiative a whole range of species that are of conservation concern, and has started to engage with non-Arctic states. For example, China, Japan, the Republic of Korea are very active in the work that we're doing. India is becoming very active. And there we have to look at, for the first time, the Council has agreed upon this action plan that looks at conservation actions, not just within the Arctic, but also in areas far beyond the Arctic. And in order to pursue those actions defined in this action plan, then that requires a much more dynamic engagement with non-Arctic states, and discussions with India or with China on how we can achieve conservation actions for migratory bird species in those areas. Because it's great if they're conserving particular species that are under conservation threat, let's say in northern Russia or Norway, but those conservation actions are of limited effect if those birds travel down to the Yellow Sea and they're where they would normally nest or feed is land that's been reclaimed, coastal reclamation, development. So we need to find a way to work together, and it's a very nice example of how we can bring northern and southern hemispheres together on an issue of common concern. And it's just one example of how the Council is trying to find new and innovative ways to try and engage with those non-Arctic states on a more equal footing. As I said, I'm a geographer, so I like to put maps and everything. And I think this is a very nice map because it shows you the flyways and the species that we're looking at in this particular migratory birds program. And they've experienced huge declines, but you can see very closely how they link certain parts of the Arctic to areas way down in the southern hemisphere. So for example, in our office, we even have a staff member now based in Ecuador, and who's responsible for managing our Americas flyway and trying to work with partners in South America and North America for conservation goals. Even though there are no South American countries that are party to the Arctic Council, they still, there's an incentive or a necessity to engage with them. Increasingly, you can see in the Arctic Council, when it's starting to address biodiversity or conservation issues, it's moving from not just monitoring and assessing what's happening, but also starting to look at more sort of practical on the ground issues and trying to find ways that it might actually influence them. And I just put an example of this in here because this is a new project. Wildfires are very much in the news over the last couple of years. And this is a new initiative within the council, which is looking at wildfire ecology and the impacts of wildfires on biodiversity. And the reason I put this in here is because it's a very nice example of how an Indigenous organization can influence the agenda of the Arctic Council, because this is an initiative led by the Gwich'in Council within the Arctic Council, and they selected Arctic wildfires as something of primary concern for their peoples, and they've managed to bring this onto the agenda of at least 2 or 3 of the Arctic Council working groups to look at how to map, understand wildfires, look at ways to exchange lessons learned and management experiences across the Arctic, and how to include Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous fire management practices and knowledge in that process. So it's a very nice example of how you can start to meld those 2 different types of perspectives and knowledge together to find or to come up with a better product at the end. It is a product that's just starting now. It's an initiative, but it's I think an interesting one in the context of how you can get lots of dissimilar parties at the same table working for a common goal. I put this as an example in there as well because it's very much something that's discussed when it comes to global issues as well, and that's mainstreaming biodiversity, or how to ensure that biodiversity objectives or concerns are taken into account when you're looking at development activities in the Arctic. And as part of the work within the council, within the CAF working group, we have an initiative that's been running for the last 4 years now, looking at trying to engage with the mining industry. And now this is a very challenging issue, and I find it fascinating because very often I find myself at meetings with mining representatives, and they come from a different worldview, different approach, but nonetheless, the council is able to provide a neutral venue for these different parties to come together and try to find how they might actually cooperate together, or at least have a discussion on that. And we're in the process now of preparing a report for the meeting of foreign ministers of the Arctic states in May on the outcomes of this process and what might happen next and how the council might engage with the mining sector. So it's just another example of one way in which the Arctic Council is trying to find more innovative ways to start to tackle some of the very complex issues that you have in the Arctic. And when it comes to biodiversity, those things touch social, economic, and environmental issues all rolled into one. And I was just going to finish on a map because, of course, as a geographer, I like to show maps everywhere. And this is, I think, a nice map to end on because it's a map of protected areas distribution in the Arctic. It shows the global biodiversity targets that the states had agreed to reach in the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity and called the Aichi targets, and of course they were due to be reached on 2020 last year, and none of those targets were reached in a global scale, which is quite sad. But at the moment, there's a lot of work ongoing now to develop a new global biodiversity framework. There's the initiations of a treaty on negotiations on the Treaty of Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. All of those different global issues are starting to impact upon the way in which the Arctic states, through the Arctic Council, are starting to look at biodiversity issues. And now they start to look at connectivity between protected areas. They start to look at other area conservation measures. And it makes it a very dynamic and interesting area to look at the moment in the context of where will the Council go with all of these different outside forces starting to come into play. And as I know that you're, I think most of your students at different stages in your academic careers, but we have quite a focus on data management within CAF as well. So all of the information for any of those maps or any of the graphics I would have shown are all available on what's known as the Arctic Biodiversity Data Service, which functions as an Arctic node within, for example, UNESCO's Ocean Biogeographic Information System, or the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, and all of these sort of global data warehouses. So a key underlying goal of much of our work is that we try to make sure that where there's no restrictions on data, that's made freely available as well, to try and sort of inform a more collective understanding of what's happening in Arctic issues. But maybe I'll stop there, because there's an awful lot of work that goes on in the Council, and that's a very, very short, quick summary of some of the work that's undertaken. And I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have. So,
thank you so much. If everyone could join me in giving a huge virtual round of applause for a great and really comprehensive presentation. I know we have lots of positive comments already coming in, and also lots of questions. I'm going to ask Sasha if you would like to come on and ask your question first.
Sure. Yeah, I was wondering what does CAF do, if anything, to make sure that it's not overly focusing on charismatic megafauna, and what their process is for deciding which species to monitor?
okay, well, I mean, it's always a challenge, because there's always more of an interest and often the more resources directed towards megafauna and things like this. But what CAF has developed is a series of 4 ecosystem-based monitoring plans for marine, freshwater, coastal, and terrestrial biodiversity. And for example, if you look at the marine monitoring plan, there we look at sea ice biota. We look at all aspects of the ecosystem and try to pick out those which are most important. And in the sense that a change there indicates some greater overall change or trend. And they're not just charismatic megafauna, they range from a whole range of different levels of the ecosystem. But of course, one of our challenges is data very often is fragmented, or it might not exist for, and there's a lot of, for example, there's an awful lot of bird data, but there's less data, let's say, on some aspects of biota and things like that. So it's a challenge, but we've identified them. And now what we're in the process of doing is trying to implement those ecosystem monitoring plans. And through the implementation of those plans, we start to try and identify what are essential components and what data is available, where are the data gaps and things like that. And that helps us then direct efforts towards trying to fill those data gaps.
Thank you. Pat, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how CAF and, I don't know how you pronounce it, PAME work together. How do you have these different departments, as you said, work together, because the issues are always overlapping, or it seems like they would be?
Yeah, they are sometimes, but actually CAF and the PAME secretariats are both co-located. They're based here in Northern Iceland. So at that administrative level, we share staff and we're very closely connected to each other. But in terms of how CAF and PAME connect together, the Arctic Council through PAME developed what's known as the Arctic Marine Strategic Plan, that covers sort of overarching goals and objectives for an awful lot of things related to marine issues in the Arctic. And the action plan that I referred to in my presentation, we've gone through that's been aligned and mapped to the goals and objectives of the Arctic Marine Strategic Plan. And through that mapping process, we've identified areas that where we need to combine our respective strengths in terms of knowledge and science, or knowledge and policy issues together. So there's an increasing number of joint activities. So for example, we're working together jointly on invasive alien species, on looking at marine protected areas, on looking at other area conservation measures. So there's a lot of sort of cross activities across the groups. But of course, you have to remember as well is that CAF and PAME, they are the Arctic states. So the Arctic states are represented in both groups. So they're not separate entities in that extent.
Thank you. Chloe, would you like to come on and maybe ask your question next?
Yeah, hi. I'm also having camera problems, so apologies, but I'm here. Yeah, so I have a slightly convoluted question. I guess my main question is, how do you get people to engage at the kind of systems level? I feel like the polls are a catch-all for lots of different types of science, politics, governance, management, that kind of thing. But I also find that people still like sitting in their comfortable like categories. So I'm currently part of a planning committee for a conference, and the oceanographers have their viewpoints, and the atmospheric scientists have their viewpoints, and even though we're just talking about the pole, they're still like really hesitant to merge together. So I'm wondering, kind of what challenges you experience and how you get people to engage at that systems wide level.
Well, I mean, it is always a challenge to push people out of their comfort zones, and but there's an increasing push that we need to take a more holistic approach to what's happening in the Arctic, so that we try and develop more sort of integrated systems when we're looking at what's happening there. So, for example, the AMAP and the CAF working group now are currently in the process of launching a joint assessment to look at climate change impacts and feedbacks. And that's one effort to try and link scientists from the world of biodiversity or ecology with those who are very focused on, climate change issues or very specific contaminants. And it can be challenging to bring those together, and it gets even more complicated when you try and bring co-production of Indigenous knowledge into the mix as well. So there's no easy answer to that, but it's something that people are very conscious of, and also increasingly a need to involve sociologists or socioeconomic scientists into the process as well, because we need to understand the systems provided by nature, the impact that they're having. Looking at complex issues like marine mammal harvest is very sensitive, but so you need to have a lot of different sort of knowledge fields involved. But the way that people are actually engaged in Arctic Council activities is that when Arctic states or the Indigenous groups agree on a particular issue, then Arctic states nominate scientists. So they appoint them to participate and they allocate time for them to do that. So in that sense, it's not a challenge to have people engaged, but it is a challenge to try and have that engagement cross and be interdisciplinary.
Yeah.
Sometimes it works, sometimes not, but we're moving very slowly that way. And the challenge is, are we moving too slowly because things are happening so quickly? So are we able to, develop a process or a system that can still develop or deliver reliable science and reliable recommendations, but done in a quicker, more focused manner? And that's what we try to do through this ecosystem monitoring program, is find a way to develop or deliver more integrated reporting by focusing on just key components of the ecosystem instead of everything. But it's tough.
Thank you. It's reassuring to know that you're working on these interdisciplinary things as someone who is trying to bridge marine and social science. So
I can't say we're doing a good job of it, but we're working hard to try and do it.
We have another question that asks, how did the system get up such that the Indigenous groups do not have a voting voice? And has there been any conversation about changing this?
Well, to start with, the Arctic Council doesn't vote on anything. It's a consensus-based organization. So if the 8 Arctic states don't agree on something, then no decision is taken. They all have to agree. And from the Arctic Council was established in 1996, and in something called the Ottawa Declaration is the founding document, and in there it defines the role of Indigenous organizations. While they don't have a voting or they don't have a voice in the decision making, in practice they have quite a strong role to influence what's happening in terms of the type of work that the council undertakes. And you can see that reflected in increasing amount of time given in Arctic Council discussions on not just how to include Indigenous knowledge, but more how do you ensure meaningful engagement. And it's a very challenging thing to do. There haven't been discussions on having Indigenous organizations, permanent participants as they're known, having the same role as Arctic member states, but they still have a very powerful role within that process. And that gives them an interesting role as well when it comes to non-Arctic states, particularly states that have a lot of weight and energy behind them, such as China, India, and others, and how they engage with the Arctic, because through Indigenous permanent participants, that's one way that they can actually feed into what's happening as well, and it gives them quite an influential voice.
And we can link in our follow-up email to a webinar that was held last week on Indigenous participation and agency in the Arctic Council. So that might give some additional context to this answer. Susanna, do you want to come on and ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, I don't think I've worded it very clearly, but picking up a little bit of what Arne was talking about, and Victoria, when you spoke at the beginning about some of the frameworks that we've had that haven't been successful and the reasons for that. Just looking at the missing the 2020 deadlines for biodiversity, where do you go from, where does that push you in a different direction? Is it, there are reasons for that specifically that relate to your work? How are you changing what you're doing, if you are, if that's relevant to what you're doing with maybe international negotiations, or maybe it's not relevant to CAF specifically?
Well, I mean, the way CAF operates is that CAF has a framework of agreements with all the relevant multilateral environment agreements, from Ramsar to the CBD and CMS and so on. And I think that the failure to reach these targets has meant that there's a renewed effort put within the council context when it comes to biodiversity, that its new action plan that is currently starting to be developed should align with the global biodiversity one, and that we should find ways to be able to more effectively report on the Arctic as a region, and where the Arctic is in reaching or not reaching those goals. Like that map I showed, or that diagram of protected areas, you can see, at least when it comes to the extent of terrestrial coverage, protected areas exceeded the target on protected areas, but it didn't for marine areas. But of course, that doesn't give the whole picture. That just tells you about extent and coverage. It doesn't tell you about what might be protected or the nature of those protections. So I think maybe one outcome of that failure to reach those 2020 targets is that there's a renewed sort of emphasis to try and find ways that we can develop ways to report on criteria and means to assess what's happening in the Arctic, and deliver that into the relevant UN systems. So it's not a simple answer, but it's an interesting question.
Yeah, a very pertinent question. Louisa, do you want to come on and ask your question next?
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom. Just this question came to my mind right now, actually. How working groups, the Arctic Council working groups, are working with the chairman of the Arctic Council? Because Russia is now a chairman for the future, for 2 years. So just like...
Do you know what? It's one of the most, makes it a very challenging job, but it makes it really interesting as well. So it's not just that you have a new chairmanship for the Arctic Council as a whole. So while Russia takes the chairmanship of the Arctic Council, Finland will take the chairmanship of CAF. And in some ways, then you have an insight into the sort of the bureaucratic structures of those states, particularly the state that chairs the working group. So, for example, Russia chaired CAF a few years ago, and I spent an awful lot of time in Russia, and it was fascinating to try and learn how the ministries work in the regional governments, and it gives you real interesting insight and connection to how things work, and they're often so different. You will go from one approach to doing things to a wildly different approach. So it's challenging, but it's really, really fascinating. One of the sort of challenges the council has as well at the moment is that, of course, it doesn't have an overall strategy to guide its activities, and its activities are done on these sort of chairmanship priorities that have developed over the last decade. And each chairmanship delivers a new set of priorities, and you try to match working group activities to those. So that makes it a little bit difficult, because much of the work of the council is not packaged into 2-year activities. It's very often long-year, multi-year projects or programs. So it's a challenge, and hopefully they are working now on a new strategy for the council, and that would make those sort of changes between chairmanship countries a little easier to manage or to sort of to plan for. But it makes it very interesting. Like I have to say, like before I used to never enjoy work until I came to work in CAF. and I've been here for a decade or so now, and it's fascinating. I've never been in a job where you always have the potential that what you're doing might have an impact on something. Usually it doesn't at all, but there's always a chance, and it's a fascinating world. And there's a real need for scientists or people who understand the sort of technical science and are able to communicate that to policy people, and are able to find ways to, innovative ways to try and get messages across, and try to link decision making to the underlying science or knowledge base. It's a fascinating world to work in. I'd recommend it as a career if anyone is.
Thank you.
Always need more people, so please send your applications. We have one final question. Judith, would you like to come on and ask yours?
Yes, thank you very much for this presentation. I have one question with regard to the HR policies of the Arctic Council, because I think they restricted or they have a requirement that you have to be a citizen of the member states, of one of the member states, in order to work for them. Does this also apply to CAF?
No.
Okay, great.
It doesn't. That policy is just for the Arctic Council Secretariat, which is based in Tromsø, and that reflects the structure of the council. So the council has a very unique structure because it's distributed. So you have the SDWG Secretariat is in Canada. That's established within the Canadian system, so it's subject to Canadian laws and approaches. CAF and PAIM are here. AMAP is, in Iceland, and AMAP is in Norway. So they all have slightly different. So, for example, we have, I'm Irish. I came to work in CAF. I'm not from, I'm Irish Icelandic, but when I came to work, I had no connection to an Arctic state in that sense. We have a staff member in South America. We've had staff members in Singapore. So, we don't restrict it like that, but they do for whatever reason in the central administration that serves the senior Arctic official level.
Okay.
But it's much more interesting to work at the working group level, because there you work with substance.
Thank you.
So that means that is an open invitation for all of you to consider work in the working group, regardless of where you are around the world.
I didn't mention the other big challenge we have is that they don't have a sustainable funding framework for the Arctic Council, so it's all run in a shoestring.
That is very true. Well, we are at our time. So again, I want to give a huge round of applause. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time, with your expertise, and just sharing an intimate view of what it means to work for CAF and generally for a working group. Thank you.
No problem, my pleasure. And please feel free with any follow-up questions you might have, and good luck with the rest of your course.
Thank you. We will share both of our speakers' emails afterwards. Next week, we are going to learn about human